Welcome to our next session. This is called Under the Dome. We've been doing this at AAKP for about the past 7 years. And the purpose of Under the Dome is to bring together some of the top lobbyists and government affairs professionals in Washington, D.C. to break down certain issues that are going on in the U.S. Congress, either currently or issues that are building a broader constituency and congressional consensus. We found this session very informative, not only for our own planning, but for many of our activists around the country. This is a fun session, and it gives you some of the practical knowledge that you need in order to be able to do regular congressional contacts, participate in congressional days, and those types of things in the months to come. We always have a great lineup of speakers, and that's no different this year. Really a very good bunch of friends and folks that work with us quite closely at AAKP. Welcome to our next speaker, and that's Peggy Tighe. Peggy serves as a principal at Powers Law Firm, and you may know her quite well as the lead legislative counsel for the American Society of Transplant Surgeons, but she is far more than that. Peggy is a longtime friend of the American Association of Kidney Patients. We've known her for over 10 years. She's been our lead help on issues related to transplant policy, regulation, and executive orders. One of the most interesting things about Peggy is her background. She has a background in disability issues, healthcare issues, aging issues, and issues that involve regulations at the intersection of patient concerns, whether that's pharmaceuticals, devices, things that we all care about as a kidney community. She's a recipient of our 2018 Congressional Action Award and Advocacy Award, which is a high distinction. And probably most importantly to us, she keeps good cheer in many of the legislative battles that we have. So we're going to begin a dialogue here about a couple of different issues of great importance to patients. And Peggy, one of the first things I'd like to ask you off the bat is, it's election season, elections are over. Practically speaking, based on your experience here in Washington, D.C. for many years, what's it like on Capitol Hill after all the dust settles on election day for those that you interact with, both elected folks and staff?
Wow. It's a really tough time for Capitol Hill staffers when there's change, like the change we're going to see happen in Congress. And so we're also in the middle of a great resignation. So who has left Capitol Hill? Who is going to be changing jobs and going somewhere else and moving to a different office or a different committee? There were many, many changes that always happen after an election, and we are on top of all of those and making sure that we're helping our allies and our friends get adjusted to the new look of Congress.
And so, from a practical standpoint, our organizations, along with the American Society of Transplantation and ASN and NKF, we spend a lot of time doing Capitol Hill visits. But in practical terms for patient advocates, what does it mean when there's such a huge changeover and you're a patient in Iowa, in Delaware, in Alabama, who's used to working with our organizations, but that change happens in January? And so, practically, what does it mean that we have to do more of in the coming year?
More and more frequent meetings because staff changes so often. So you have to be up there and building relationships and then not completely disappointed when you have to build a new relationship and talk to another person, or when there's a staffing change on a committee, or when there's members of Congress who change committees and move to a different committee. It's all very important to keep track of the people who support you, advocate for you, and watch them in their career paths. So even though somebody might have left Capitol Hill, maybe they're in a position to continue to be helpful to the transplant community.
And then what does it mean also? You've been a very big champion on this over the years, and you've really, really trained patient advocates quite seriously about there's the focus on Washington, D.C., the individual congressional and Senate offices and the committee staff, but also what goes on at their local level in those local congressional offices. So when you see new folks come into the Congress, often in their first term, what does that practically mean at the level of the local office, for example, for patient advocates?
Right. Well, I want to start by saying that ASTS really appreciates our relationship with AAKP. As the independent voice for patients, there is no more valuable stakeholder or ally that ASTS has than AAKP. I have had the privilege, and I consider it a great responsibility, to help patient advocates navigate Capitol Hill. So again, I really appreciate you doing that and working with us. And I know that the surgeons I represent could not appreciate more the relationship we have. So in moving forward, going to your fly-in, coming to Capitol Hill or doing a Zoom call with the Capitol Hill staffers isn't enough. You really have to go beyond that and go, as Paul suggests, to the district offices. They also have corollary staffers in the district offices who are there to talk to you. So if you want to, talk about these are the issues I'm dealing with kidney transplant, dialysis, or otherwise, or here's a bill I really want your boss to support, you have two beautiful open windows to talk to your members of Congress in your district office or on Capitol Hill.
And then, Peggy, taking a look at what the purpose of our summit this year is. AAKP, as you know, has gone up to Capitol Hill with nearly every kidney organization in the kidney community. And this year, we're charting a new course. Our incoming president, Ed Hickey, is a former AA on Capitol Hill on the House side and has worked extensively on the Senate side as well. And so what we're doing in this policy summit is we're talking to many, many more voices than we have before, because we're shaping and putting together a patient-centered policy agenda, a national kidney patient policy agenda. And as we're doing that, I wanted to get your insights on what's moving around in kidney policy and transplant policy specifically that we might be able to be of assistance on as we're putting that agenda together and then educating our folks on how to get involved for 23 and 24.
Sure. Well, I'm most excited that we worked with the AAKP and a couple other groups to get consensus language on a slightly different bill, but very important differences in Living Donor Protection Act. So the Living Donor Protection Act, I'm calling it's our year. We've got to do this. We have a consensus with the insurance industry. So we should be able to be moving a package as quickly as we possibly can in Congress this coming year on Living Donor Protection Act. It's time. We also are facing challenges, significant challenges of folks in the government who are saying that they know better about transplant policy. And they want to make changes that generally we're in agreement with the kind of changes they want to make the system more inclusive and make it more diverse, make sure there are more transplants available, that more people get transplanted. All those are great ideas. But honestly, the devil's in the details. We have to be very careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, as they say, and upend all the processes and the requirements and rules that are out there unnecessarily, because the implications for patients are so very important. So having patients inform that debate, having physicians, surgeons inform that debate is critical going forward. Congress never should be the ones making transplant decisions. Those transplant decisions should be made by patients and their surgeons and their entire transplant team. And that's a strongly held belief, I know, between our two organizations. And we are very active in making sure that they hear the surgeon voice. And I know you all are wonderfully active in making sure all government entities, hear the patient voice.
Well, I appreciate it. Later on today, we'll have an interview with Dr. Matt Cooper from Georgetown, talking about some of the developments in science and policy related to greater diversity in transplantation for underserved populations. But I wanted to circle back to one of the legislative issues that we've worked on for a long time, and that's the Living Donor Protection Act. And I guess two questions for you. In that piece of legislation, I think the focus has been on protections, but you've been very strong on the codification of those things that we've already achieved with the Department of Labor in 2018. And I wanted you to elaborate on that because I sometimes think folks are missing the details there on the Family Medical Leave Act and some of the other things for protection. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, happy to. I think the simplest way to describe the Living Donor Protection Act is it's all about removing disincentives to transplant, right? So ultimately, the goal is to remove disincentives to transplant. What are those disincentives to transplant? One is, will I be able to keep my job? And the second one is, will I be able to get the insurance I need for myself and my family? So taking the first one first, will I be able to keep my job? We knew for years that the Family Medical Leave Act probably meant to include time off for the giving of an organ, right? But it wasn't clear. So we worked together, I think, in a beautiful way, ASTS and AAKP, to go to the administration and say, you meant this, right? So as a law firm, at my firm, we were able to find what I call the silver bullet, which was information in the legislative conversation they had in Congress in the House. And in that conversation, one member said to the other, hey, when we're passing Family Medical Leave Act, do we mean this for giving the gift of life in the context of organ donation? And the answer on the House floor was yes. So we put that in a letter, sent it over to the administrator and said, hey, isn't it time to make this clear? And it was. And then Paul, AAKP, and others went back and said to the administration, hey, you really need to do this, and this is why. So it was a real team effort, and that's important. So now if you Google, hey, does Family Medical Leave Act cover me? So I can keep my employment as long as I do everything else in the context of the Family Medical Leave Act. And the answer 5 years ago, if you had Googled this, it said, go call a lawyer. Now it says, oh yeah, you're covered, because what the Department of Labor produced was a letter that said you are covered. What's better than that? A law that says you're covered, because a letter might go away depending on the next administration. A law is why that section is still in the Living Donor Protection Act, and we need to pass it.
Yeah, no, actually, that was one of the great achievements and a great example of how superior research arms the civil servants with the information they need that they may miss or not be aware of on the congressional record. And in that instance, Richard Knight and I had the opportunity to go to the Department of Labor. I had served there as the chief of staff for Secretary Chow, but we were able to meet with not just the secretary, but just as importantly, the career civil servants in the Wage and Hour Division who actually prepared that memorandum from the secretary for the Department of Labor, clarifying that. And you're correct. That is exactly what we're trying to get so that it doesn't go away. I think that's an important thing for people to understand, that it exists now, but it's only the executive branch side of things. You really need Congress to back it up. And then in taking a look at the rest of the legislation there under the Living Donor Protection Act, what are some of the other things that you think we've been able to smooth out and hopefully position for passage that are very important that folks may not be aware of?
Well, I think there are a couple of things one thing that passed into law a couple of years back that we also work closely on is the HOPE Act. And the HOPE Act is HIV to HIV transplantation. Really important change in the law. So back in the day, there was, Ryan White Act, and there was HIV AIDS and all those problems back in the 80s. There was a prohibition against transplants from or to anybody with HIV. We all know that folks who are living longer with HIV now, and thankfully all the medications and the care that they've received, they can live longer. So the HOPE law, we were able to work together to pass so that in a research context, you can have transplantation between somebody who has HIV and somebody who has HIV, right? So the transplant can go between those two folks. This administration is now trying to broaden that, I think, in a very smart way. And we're taking a very close look at that to see if there's a broadening that will be effective and appropriate and proper of the HOPE law. So that's important. We also keep our eyes on, as we talked about, disability and underserved populations, and making sure there's not significant disparities, which there are right now, of who's getting transplanted. So the American Society of Transplant Surgeons is taking very seriously and taking a very hard look at how do we do better. We do great. Matt Cooper probably told you. Transplants are amazing, and we're over 1 million, right? It's a relatively new science, but we're doing a great job in the United States on transplantation, but we can always do better.
Yeah, no, actually, I had a chance to talk to Matt about some of the roles that patients and professionals have played together. Obviously, Richard Knight, our president, has done a fine job on the SRTR, the Scientific Registry of Transplant Recipients, and some of the other bodies that are very involved in generating the data upon which the policy is decided. And it's a great collaboration that we have together. One of the other issues I wanted to ask you about quite candidly is we've seen a lot of this stuff, and you've been around, I've been around. Many of us at AAKP have seen the highs and lows of what accusations and charges on social media and in the media do to a profession and do to institutions, in particular, the American transplant system. And there's been a lot of this over the past 12 or 18 months where you have folks who are not experts who might be looking for 15 minutes of fame or 15 minutes to defame and to confuse patients about the integrity of the transplant system itself and some of the institutions that are involved. And I wanted to ask you on that issue for ASTS and for the transplant community, what are some of the things that you're concerned about that are being talked about on the Hill? And what are some of the things that you would encourage patient advocates to do to get to the ground truth about what's going on in the discussions about the transplant system and allocation and issues like that?
Right. I love that you said getting to the truth. So, where I feel like we are with this debate, and it's not really a debate, it's a shoot first and ask questions later kind of conversation that we're having. And that's unfortunate. That is unfair. It's the wrong way to make policy. I think the right way to make policy, and again, Paul and I are old enough to remember when we did it right, is that you would ask questions of an industry and of impacted communities and find out what was right and find out what was wrong instead of just shooting up a system or throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I am very concerned that there are folks who are trying to make news and who are trying to find the smoking gun or the dirty actor or something like that in the transplant universe. It would be far better broached, I think, and thought through if it was really thought through. If we use the existing systems, find out where we can make changes that would significantly improve where we're going without looking for a headline or a news story.
So, Peggy, let me ask you another question. And this draws from your background, and folks may not know this, but you were one of the top guns for the American Medical Association and for the Health Insurance Association of America. And for folks that are watching, there are a lot of things that are said about lobbyists in different ways that are not positive. But if you've been around for a long time, you understand that oftentimes a very objective and balanced view of industry or a particular industry is highly valued on Capitol Hill because it's an amount of expertise that staff may not be exposed to. And Peggy has a superb reputation in Washington, D.C. and in state capitals for understanding different industries, the American Medical Association, the health insurance industry, and the transplant industry. And Peggy, based on that background, I wanted to ask you, as patients are getting ready to be active, not just for 2023, but also for 2024, you've encouraged our listeners to be involved in congressional visits. But what other things can make them effective advocates based on what you've seen and how you work with patients and have over many decades?
Yeah, you're a far more effective advocate when you know your opposition. There is no question in my mind. You have stories to tell, and they're important stories to tell, but where you're tying your stories into your knowledge of the opposition and also what the bill does. Everyone wants to hear your story. That's very important. But if your story isn't logically tied into what the bill does and how the bill would make your life better, you've not had a good meeting. I'll be really honest with you. You have to think about what you're selling and how your story fits into what you're selling, and you'll be far more effective.
And then let me ask you this, Peggy. In your past, on some of the tough legislative issues that you've been involved in, I know that you were very active in the late 1990s on the Patients' Rights Bill in securing that. And I think one of the things that sometimes people get confused about is when there's a change in power in Washington and what looks like political gridlock, everyone assumes that nothing's going to happen. But you've been directly involved in many different issues over the years where, despite very strong differences in the White House and in the Congress and the House and the Senate, you have actually been party to some of these things that have passed in tough times with bipartisan consensus. And so, looking into the crystal ball for 2023 and 2024, even though this week and next week there'll be a lot of news about a change in Congress, give our listeners a sense of what's your sense of optimism about the ability to still pull off consensus legislation based on issues like transplant and kidney health in the coming year or two?
Here's what I know for sure. We're in a divided country and we're in a divided Congress. That can bring its opportunities and it can bring its challenges. So with just a mere number of seats difference in the House and the Senate, that begs for people to work together to reach consensus. The American public has seen divided government for many years now, right? What they see that they don't like about it is when there's a stall and Congress can't get anything done. What they like about it is when compromise has to be made because you're forced into that compromise because the margins are so tight. I see that as an opportunity. I think that is a cool way to be able to influence policymakers with the right answers instead of just having some supermajority make a decision for you. You're forced to compromise, meaning that you better come up with the right policy and good policy going forward.
And then one last question for you, Peggy. And I appreciate your time so much, and our listeners do as well. Look, apart from issues of legislation and regulation and implementation and management and all these other things that we've had a chance to talk about, you've walked the halls of Congress with many patients with many types of different disabilities, whether it's kidney disease or HIV or severe physical disabilities. Tell me this, as a professional, what's the impact that a patient has when you see them and when you listen and watch them tell their story to an elected official? How do you feel after you've been in meetings with folks like us? And when we walk away and go home, what's your sense of the impact that we've been able to make, not just on you, but also on elected people?
Well, I'm fed. It feeds me. It's wonderful to know that there are real people I'm advocating for. And I think the Hill staffers feel the same way. When you deliver a concise, tightly tailored message that is directly connected to the bill you want that member of Congress to sponsor or blow up, then you're being an effective advocate in a way that somebody who doesn't have those conditions or disabilities can ever be. It's invaluable.
Thanks, Peggy. And again, when you folks need a good ally, and just always know AAKP is ready to serve the transplant community. And many of us, myself included, our lives are indebted to the professionals that you represent and to the institutions they represent. And a lot of us wouldn't be here today unless it was for our transplant surgeons. So it's the least that we can do to work on behalf of our donor families, on behalf of those who aren't here, and especially the professionals who are in the arena every day trying to get folks transplanted. We appreciate what you do for them, very much so.
Thank you, Paul. I know we appreciate you even more.
Thank you very much. Thanks again, Peggy.